Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. This is Nicole Jansezian. I'm the news editor at All Israel News. And I just want to welcome you. I apologize for the lack of video at the moment. We're having some technical difficulties, but we thought we might as well get started. Thank you for your patience and welcome. You can write in the chat where you're dialing in from. And of course, we will take your questions at the end, well, maybe throughout as we go along. But we just want to welcome you. We are just right now getting all the exit polling right now. As you can see, here's our first look. Okay, this is a poll from last week. This was the very last poll that came in before. It was from last week, from March 18th, and Likud had an average had 29. Yesh Atid, which is Yair Lapid's party, was second, and we had New Hope was at 12, and Yamina was at 11. So we'll just start with those four, and wait till you see the polls from tonight. We're going to show you what's happening right now. Do you have the chart from tonight? Here is what's happening. This is the exit polling by the three Israeli channels. Tonight, Likud actually has between 31 and 33. Likud, of course, being the party of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Yes, Yesh Atid came in as the polls predicted, 18, between 16 to 18. And then we do not see New Hope, and things are definitely looking different than what we were expecting. So we're going to be talking about that. Just exit polls are notoriously unreliable. There are still 600,000 absentee ballots that need to be counted. And this year, as with everything and everywhere else in the world, there were complications due to COVID. Israel set up drive-through polling stations, so that people who were in quarantine could just get into their car, go through, drop off their, fill out and drop off their ballot without, being out in the public, and then go back into quarantine. So there were a lot of complications. So, we're still expecting a few, at least through, they're saying, the news channels right now are saying that at least through Passover, they're still going to be counting, and nobody's trusting the current polls, or the current exit polls. So anyway, that's what we have right now. So we're also going to talk about the low turnout this year. I think one thing I would like to when we get Joel on, I want to ask about the voter fatigue. If this is the fourth Israeli election in 2 years, and seems like people were just tired and didn't want to go to the polls. And so anyway, we'll see how much that affected the voting. And also we're going to talk about who is the kingmaker. So anyway, let's get right to it. So far we're doing this without video until we get that working, but I just want to introduce Joel Rosenberg. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of All Israel News. So Joel, welcome. I really would love to get your thoughts on what's happening tonight. So
thank you, Nicole. I appreciate it. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you for, I can't wait to get right into it. I mean, what are you thinking? What do you make of all this?
So the first thing is that I'm concerned by the initial headlines that I'm seeing in a lot of Israeli media, and even on Israeli television. The first thing that everybody said was, it looks like Netanyahu has clinched a narrow right-wing government. Mm-hmm. Well, and then they say 92 other caveats. So this is why All Israel News exists, because look, there's a lot of great journalism out there, but there's no way with the current numbers that you can conclude that Netanyahu has clinched anything. Okay, it's just not possible. Now he may have. Don't get me wrong. So let's say what could we possibly discern out of the current numbers? The current numbers is that after 4 elections, there's no evidence yet that Netanyahu has a decisive right-wing majority. This is what he's pushing for. This is what he wants. And 4 times in a row, if the numbers are to believe, it hasn't happened, though he might get something narrow. Now, again, you mentioned 600,000 absentee ballots, Nicole. That's a big number because, of course, Americans think of, a continent of 320 million people. So 600,000 ballots doesn't seem like a lot. Now, maybe after the recent American elections, everybody knows that every vote counts and they need to be counted properly. My point here is that Netanyahu actually he and his team could pick up several more seats in this process. And that really would probably give him a decisive edge by which he could persuade the kingmaker, right? Naftali Bennett, the right-wing party leader of a party called Yamina, which means rightward. Bennett used to be the chief of staff of Netanyahu. They've had quite a falling out, but Bennett has not ruled out working with Netanyahu, his old boss. And if Netanyahu and Likud pick up a couple more seats through absentee ballots, then that would almost certainly persuade Bennett, I think, to go with Netanyahu, even though Bennett has been saying we need to fire Netanyahu and move on and start fresh with a new CEO. However, a few seat movement in the other direction would suggest that the left, or not even the left, the center right that is opposed to Netanyahu, they could actually pick up a few more seats in each of those parties, and then you'd be in a very different position, and Netanyahu would not be able to form. So I would love to be able to open the program tonight by saying this is what's happening, but the truth is we simply cannot say yet, and I think it's irresponsible for various media outlets to act as though you could know when it is very murky. And I got to say, the only other thing I can pull out of this so far would be based on these current numbers. It doesn't look like who else would put together a government. Okay. Right. So that's a big issue.
Right. And so the second, the party with the second highest votes is Yesh Atid, which is led by Yair Lapid. And the question is, would he be able to form a government?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I'm having lots of technical difficulties tonight. Okay. Basically, Israel is a center-right country, okay? Based on these numbers, within, again, a margin of a few either way, you have roughly 80 to 85 seats on the center-right. And maybe 25 to 30 seats, I haven't counted them yet exactly, on the center to the left. And then you have, 9 or 10 Arab seats, okay? So this is a center-right country. It's one of the few countries in the world, certainly in the Western world, in the democracies, where the left wing of the country has completely collapsed, right? I mean, when we talk about these numbers, like could move a few, each party could have a few less or a few more. There's a few parties that could be obliterated.
Yeah.
If the numbers move against them in the wrong way. So, and those would be left-wing parties mostly. Mm-hmm. So Lapid, he has some left-wing positions. He's mostly a centrist. Okay. So the challenge, however, is in a center-right country, why not have a center-right leader? This is the case that Netanyahu is making. This is the case that Naftali Bennett of Yamina is making. Not, don't go with Netanyahu, go with me, Naftali Bennett, because I'm right, but I'm not Bibi. And Gideon Sa'ar, who was the number 2 in the Likud party, number 2, the closest deputy to Netanyahu, but sort of had a huge falling out with Netanyahu, left Likud in December, started his own party, New Hope, looked like he was the odds-on favorite to win, to become the next prime minister, really. And his party they were at 18 to 20 seats when they first were announced in December. They're coming in at maybe 5, 6, 7. I mean, it didn't go well for Gideon Sa'ar, but Sa'ar, Bennett, and Netanyahu have all been making the case. We are a center-right country. You need a center-right leader. Go with me, okay? And so that leaves Yair Lapid in a very serious challenge, because he does appear to have the second highest number of seats, somewhere between 16 and 20,
right,
give or take. That's pretty good in this system, but there's almost nobody who is going to make him the prime minister if all these other parties form around him, unless Nicole, as you and I know, unless everybody's so determined to find any way to stop Netanyahu that they decide we're going to go with Lapid. But we can get into some of those nuances in a few minutes. Right now, I know we're trying to help people frame the outside of the edges of the 5,000 piece puzzle.
Okay. Well, I do want to talk about, there were some surprises in this election. Well, so far, based on the polling. But let's talk, we'll back up, and say, what were the major issues of this campaign?
Well, there are political issues, and then there've been policy issues. The number one policy issue in terms of foreign policy and national security is the threat from Iran and from Iran's main terror proxy force, Hezbollah, which has 150,000 missiles in Lebanon, aimed at Israel, ready to fire at a moment's notice. So this is the grave danger to Israel, that Iran and its terror proxy forces could be coming for us, right? And that's something we've dealt with for a long time. But this is, in my view, it's the number one reason that people, even who are frustrated with Netanyahu, still think he might be the right guy to lead us, because he's such a world statesman. He's got so much experience. And anyone else you pick to be prime minister doesn't have the experience that he has. So that's the number one foreign policy and national security issue, is Iran and Iran's terror proxy forces and the threat posed to Israel. The number one is the COVID crisis. Now with vaccinations, we seem to be turning, we are turning the corner. The number of infections are down. The number of deaths are down. The number of serious cases are down as low as we've seen since last November. So this is progress. However, the economy has suffered. So many people are out of work. 70,000 businesses have failed. People are upset. They're angry. They're scared. They've been going a long time with very little income or no income. And so these are the policy issues. But if you take all that together, Nicole, as we've been reporting on All Israel News, the real issue driving this campaign is, okay, yeah, that's all true, but do you want Netanyahu to lead, or do you want him to leave? That's really the main issue in this campaign. And that's why in our analysis that we've been writing over recent weeks, we've been trying to explain to people who don't live here and who only know the name Netanyahu, brace yourselves, because the forces that are against Netanyahu keep building. Now, they can't seem to find the one person to lead them. This is the challenge. Right. But the anti-Bibi, anti-Netanyahu forces actually are much larger than the pro-Netanyahu forces. However, to Netanyahu's benefit, 9 or 10 of those seats are in the Arab parties who historically haven't wanted to be involved in helping form an actual government ever, But that again could change. I mean, maybe
Right.
so that's why it's so hard to say tonight. How much danger is Netanyahu in?
Right. Well, the magic number is 61. For those of you who don't know, the Israeli parliament system, there's 120 seats in the Knesset, and a leader will be recommended, probably, the one with the highest votes. Some parties will recommend, and then the president, who is Reuven Rivlin, will have that person try to build a coalition. So then the magic number is 61. You just have to have a simple majority. So as you can see here, we've got pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi. Just to explain, Benjamin Netanyahu is Bibi in Israel. So pretty much
it's his childhood nickname.
Yeah.
Bibi. It's funny. It's normally in Western democracy, you don't really have a nickname be the name that you're known by, but nicknames are very popular here. Most Israeli political leaders are known by their nickname.
Yeah. So I almost said Ruby Rivlin instead of Reuven Rivlin.
Ruby, right, exactly.
So, but the magic number is 61. So pretty much right now, how the news is reporting it, and as you can see on this chart in our screen, there's how Netanyahu could build a 61 seat majority, and he just gets there. And he gets there, according to our calculations, based on the current exit polls, which could change. He gets there with Naftali Bennett, and that's why Bennett is right now considered the kingmaker, despite the fact that how many seats does Bennett have now? About 6?
I mean, well, it's a big surprise. He's been tracking at between 11, 12, 13 seats, and at the moment, he's coming in at 7. If that really is true, and it may not be, so it's hard to say, but if it were true, that would actually be a significant collapse, not only of Gideon Sa'ar and his New Hope party, but of Naftali Bennett, both of which were saying, I'm the guy to replace Netanyahu. Right. But Bennett, as you're saying, has positioned himself by never saying that he would never serve with Bibi, just that he prefers not to.
Right. Well, he did say he was saying fire the CEO, but then this week he seemed to, when he signed a pledge to not serve with Lapid, who was emerging as the second strongest candidate. Right. So it seems like he was setting it up for right now, and it seems to be working in his favor at the moment. But in the meantime,
I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced of that. It very well could happen. Look. At a certain level, you have to say that the odds are in Netanyahu's favor because there's not a clear opponent to him. If Lapid was at 25 and Netanyahu was at 32, 33, then you've got a very different setup. Or if Bennett was, or if Gideon Sa'ar was, but you don't have that. Hey, I see somebody about to join us.
Yeah.
Danny Ayalon. Danny, welcome to All Israel News. Danny Ayalon is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. He served as deputy foreign minister for the state of Israel. He, of course, served as a member of Knesset. And he and I also are not only good friends for many, many years, 20 some years. He and I wrote recently on Sunday an article for Newsweek magazine looking at are Israelis preparing for a post-Netanyahu era? And I'm curious, Danny, as you join us, thank you so much. You're on our All Israel News advisory board right from when we started. Are we or aren't we? It's everyone's trying to make conclusions based on exit polls, but you're a pretty shrewd hand at this stuff. How do you assess what we know so far?
Okay. Well, first of all, Joel, you missed a very important piece on my resume, which is I am an avid reader of all of Joel Rosenberg books and novels.
Thank you.
And not sure. Well, I think that again in hindsight, and I think we've discussed it before. I think statistically it was Benjamin Netanyahu's to lose, because there were more parties hanging on a thread, hovering around the threshold. It seems like now the one that did not pass, which is the RAM, which is the Arab Islamist party, did not pass,
Right.
which means automatically half of its votes in effect go for the Bibi's camp. And this is why we see that Bibi right now has 61 together with Bennett. I don't think that Bennett had any other choice but to join Bibi Netanyahu, because this is what his voters expect. And we see that all those who went against Bibi directly, head to head, whether it was Gideon Saar with the New Hope party, whether it was Avigdor Lieberman, all of them have Gideon pretty much, he just crashed, and Lieberman did not go up. So it's a big night for Bibi, and I think that I don't see how the polls or the exit and the final results will change much. I think what we see now is pretty much what will be the I would say the final votes and the final results.
Look, you may be right, Danny. You've got a lot of experience. You've actually run for these offices. You've been part of, you were both part of the Likud party at one point, and then the Israel Beitenu, Israel Our Home party with Avigdor Lieberman for a number of years till you left the Knesset. So so I defer to you. However, my favorite word in Hebrew that I've learned is aval. However, because it always feels like something seems true, and then somebody tells you, well, aval. Now, so here's the thing. In one way of looking at these early numbers is that Netanyahu is not in danger because there's not one clear leader who can galvanize decisively all the people that are wanting Netanyahu to leave. Okay, so that's an advantage that Netanyahu has. Mm-hmm. However, again, a movement of just a few seats, since it's so close, could prevent actually Netanyahu from being able to form a 61-seat majority. And then he faces a very dangerous situation politically, I think. And I just want to introduce this to you because in an interview I did with a blue and white candidate the other day who was running with Benny Gantz, this was a Christian Arab woman, and she made to the point to me that I had forgotten. If nobody can put together a government in the next month or so, then new elections will be triggered. And according to the legally binding agreement, as I understand it, at least as it was reminded to me by this candidate, in November, Benny Gantz actually becomes the prime minister. Now, if an election were scheduled prior to that, then that wouldn't be true. But if it got stalled in any way, Bibi actually is removed from being prime minister, and then he's in danger legally because he wouldn't be allowed to serve as just a regular member of Knesset because he's under indictment. Now, I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen. That's a lot of what ifs, but take a moment to look at what's Netanyahu's best case scenario and what is his worst case scenario, given what you're seeing so far.
Well, first of all, theoretically, you're right, because let's say if Netanyahu does not get his 61, and then we go into fifth elections. That means that the law of the land is still the one that was passed by the former Knesset, which means Gantz is still up for rotation in November. So Bibi's game would be to, in case he doesn't get the 61, to have elections before November. And this is, which means that he will not take all the time that the law allows him to build a coalition. That means his decision is, if he doesn't have the 61, he will have to immediately call for new elections so that he will have the new elections before November. That means usually you take 90 days when the Knesset dissolves itself. We will have a new Knesset next week. The new Knesset, if we, 61 has to vote for a prime minister, no 61, then the Knesset will have to dissolve itself. And this is what Bibi will vie for. But again, I think that the chances, there's so many ifs for him not to pass the 61 threshold that I see it very, very far-fetched. So right now, all the stars are aligned for Bibi Netanyahu. And why is it? It's because the opposition, first of all, it's very much fragmented. And also, it has no ideology to speak of. You cannot just run an anti-campaign, anti-Bibi campaign without really pointing out to a vision, to an ideology. And 3 times they have failed. Now it's the 4th time. So I don't think that they would even want to have a 5th time, because, Joel, if there is a 5th time, I think that voter fatigue will be such that, already in this election cycle, turnout went down substantially. If there is, God forbid, another cycle of elections, I think it will go even further down, and that will ensure Bibi's staying in. Because for Bibi, if, as long as he runs as an interim, he is still the prime minister. He will have to, of course, have the next obstacle in November, but he will do everything to advance elections before next November, which means then he will have to hand over the office of prime minister to Benny Gantz. This will not happen. And I think there is a lesson here to learn, that you have to show something positive and not go on the negative.
Yes, on that note, I would say that I'm actually stunned by how poorly Gideon Sa'ar ran his race. And the reason it's important to discuss that for a moment is, and I've known Gideon since 2006. He's spoken at one of my conferences. I've interviewed him. I know him. He was so popular in Likud as the number 2.
Right.
He took a number of Likud members, current and former members of parliament, with him to start New Hope. They came out with a lot of hope, and they're finishing the night badly. Now, again, he could pick up a couple seats, but even all of the not just the exit polling, the public polling was trending downward very rapidly in these final weeks. So I just want to ask you, and Gideon really ran an anti-Bibi campaign. He didn't really run in where he was making news. This is what I would do differently. This is what I would do differently. I would say actually Naftali Bennett did more of that. But now I'm already seeing a member of Likud Current inviting all of the members of Gideon Sa'ar's party. All of you except Gideon are all welcome back into the fold. You're a former Likud, Nick. Assess the state of Likud. And the reason I'm going to press on just one more point is, yes, I think there's a lot of analysis, yourself included tonight, that's saying very positive things about Netanyahu. But Netanyahu still has a fundamental problem, which is after 4 elections, he cannot persuade a solid majority, which is showing that the country is very conflicted. Many are done with him, but they're not sure who else can lead the country instead of him.
Yeah, but Joel, you have to see that Likud is not just a party, it's a movement. And it's a very popular movement which goes down to grassroots. And this is why it's so much apart from all the others. You see in these elections, Likud will have 32 or 31 or 33, where the next second party is Lapid, right? Yesh Atid, with maybe 18 votes. And on the other side, on the left, you have all kinds of mix and matches. There are new parties coming, different kind of amalgamations and alliances, which are very ad hoc. And here you see something which is very, very steady. Now, it is true that Netanyahu, from the old days of Likud with having 38 or 48, this is not in the cards anymore. But still, he is far ahead of anyone else. Now, the ones who made really the change was, and I think the cause of all these multiple election cycles is Mr. Lieberman, because Mr. Lieberman, back in the first elections in September of 2019, he ran on a campaign of right wing. That he ran and he got his votes on the basis that he said that he would sit with Bibi Netanyahu. And then he flipped in a very blatant way. And this is what kind of put all the system in a stalemate, because there is a clear majority for the right of center bloc in Israel. And you see that even when Gideon Saar is peeling away some of the Likud members, and Bennett, and Smotrich, still he has 33 votes. And even if Gideon Saar will not join, but those who ascribe to Bibi's ideology, today they make a real majority of the Knesset. You have about 75 members of Knesset who are basically on the right side of the map.
Yeah.
Except, that they ran against Bibi. This is basically the 7 or 5 or 6, whatever, seats of Gideon Saar, and 5 or 6 more of Lieberman.
Yeah.
And this is what
I do think,
changed.
You and I, in our Newsweek column, which is posted at the All Israel News site, we said, don't count Netanyahu out. He's a shrewd political cat. This is a politician who keeps finding ways. He knows the country. There's a growing movement against him, and even from the right. That his problem is not on the left. His problem is that people on the center and people on the right, more and more of them say they'll never work with him. This is narrowing his path, and yet he still seems to potentially find a way. And again, my number one takeaway is that people are conflicted. Those who want a change don't see one leader that they can trust.
Absolutely.
And therefore people are, maybe we should just stick with Bibi because we know his flaws, but his strengths are really quite impressive. I'll give you the last word on this, and I appreciate your time.
Yes, I would say, just in analogy to American elections, I would say Bibi is like the Nixon. If you recall, back in '68, the first elections, it was Nixon against Hubert Humphrey, and the Democrats' slogan was, "Will you buy a second-hand car from Tricky Dick?" And the Americans did. Because they said, well, maybe he is not the most scrupulous character, but we trust him better to take care of our interests, whether it's the economy, whether it's Vietnam, or anything else. I think this is what we see here today, that Bibi Netanyahu looms larger than anyone else when it comes to national security, when it comes to the economy, and he has also some real luck. Israeli high tech is doing very well, despite, or maybe because of the corona. The natural gas fields are also helping the economy tremendously.
Right.
And
I said I would give you the last word, but I'll still give it to you. But one last question. What effect do you think that Netanyahu is widely perceived as having badly handled the coronavirus crisis overall, but the vaccination process he's handled quite well, and we're starting to get out and walk around and ride bikes and go on hikes. And I took my family up to the Golan the other day. That timing of that, how much do you think, if anything, did that have an effect on maybe shoring up some of Bibi's support here in the final days?
Well, Joel, very much so. He pretty much bet the house on the vaccinations. Unlike Trump, I believe that Trump was voted out because he didn't take the corona seriously, unlike Bibi. And he put everything on the corona. If you recall, Mr. Burla, the CEO of Pfizer, he was on Israeli television saying that Bibi called him 30 times to make sure Israel will get the vaccines. sometimes it, the all hours of the day. But my last point, Joel, is that also he had a genius move, and that is to go and really split the Arab votes. By splitting the Arab votes, he made sure that the other camp will not have the 61. And indeed, he succeeded where the Iran, the Islamist party, did not pass the threshold. That means they lost 4, votes on the or seats on the left side, which means that he got 2 plus. That's what made him go over the 60 to get the 61.
Danny Ayalon, you're a mensch, former ambassador to the United States, former deputy foreign minister to Israel, author of this new analysis we did together in Newsweek, and a member of the All Israel News Advisory Board, as well as venture capitalist and so many other things. Danny, thank you so much for being with us on this very interesting night, and we've got many nights ahead to figure this out.
Absolutely. Stay tuned. Thank you very much, Joel.
Chag Sameach as you prepare for Passover.
Happy Passover.
Nicole, introduce our next guest, if you would.
Okay. Hi, we have Eric Steckelbach is with us. And Eric, you're calling in from the United States?
Yes, I'm in New York City. I apologize, guys. I had a few technical difficulties, but I am here now. It's great to be with you.
Great. I would love to know what this looks like from the U.S. We're sitting here in Jerusalem in the epicenter getting all this news right now. In fact, while you were speaking to Danny Ayalon, Netanyahu just said, made a statement. He said, this is a giant win for the right wing, and I'm going to build a stable government. And so there you have it. Now he's sort of declared victory in a sense. So anyway, how does this look like from where you sit?
Well, and let's also note that Eric is a member of the Trinity Broadcasting Network, TBN. He's their news director and has been to Israel many times, quite an expert on, especially on counterterrorism and security issues. Eric, yes, please.
Yeah, Joel, you and I discussed, it's great to be with you guys, first of all. I think for Americans, they see a Bibi victory as a great thing. I don't know that they certainly know Benjamin Netanyahu, obviously, Prime Minister, 15 years overall, including for the past 12 years. So I think the majority of Americans, in particular American evangelicals, who are obviously very pro-Israel, are excited about this result. I know there's a lot of different feelings on the ground in Israel about it, of course, but here in America, I would say the vast majority of Americans, number one, are pro-Israel, and number two, are very friendly or have a very positive view of Benjamin Netanyahu. So I think most Americans, if this does play out and the prime minister is able to form a government, he is the victor here, I think most Americans would be pretty happy with that result.
I think that's well put. Go ahead, Nicole.
No, I was going to say, I was going to ask, so how does this look like continuing also now with the Biden administration? If it's, Netanyahu is going to continue, and now if Naftali Bennett also joins the administration, in the Israeli administration, how does this work with the new government in the U.S.?
Nicole, great question. The American people are one thing, but the Biden administration is something else entirely when it comes to Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli right wing in general. Look, Prime Minister Netanyahu over the past 4 years with the Trump administration obviously had a historically friendly U.S. government to work with, but I see this Biden administration, Nicole, as sort of an Obama third term, which means there's going to be friction. If you look at the Biden administration's agenda, they've made very clear that they are seeking to re-enter that disastrous Iran nuclear deal. That's number one. Number two, there was some talk just last week about the Biden administration pressuring Israel to move back to the 1967 lines, which President Obama also did. So I think we are headed, sadly, on a collision course in a lot of respects, mainly around Iran. The Biden White House is determined to re-enter that deal. But the interesting thing here is that Iran is not making it very easy for the United States. On Sunday, the Associated Press reported that U.S. intelligence officials captured communications from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps talking about carrying out terror attacks at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. They were apparently planning a USS Cole type of attack on American soil. So the more news like that comes out about the nefarious plans of the Iranian regime, you would think the more difficult it would be for the Biden White House to kind of re-engage with the mullahs.
Yeah, it's going to be very challenging. Like Eric, you and I have spoken on your program, The Watchman, about how the chemistry between Netanyahu and President Biden, Biden, of course, who's been around in Washington for 50 years, the chemistry is actually pretty good. They like each other. They just totally disagree with each other on most issues. And so in that sense, it'll be interesting to see if the collision course of which you describe, do both sides figure out a way to make it not public? You know, it's one thing to have private disagreements, even significant ones, but you know what Obama talked about openly was that Obama believed there should be daylight between the United States and Israel politically, and Trump countered that by saying there should not be daylight. If Israel and the United States has a disagreement, have it in private. So Biden might have big disagreements with Netanyahu and vice versa. The question is, do you think those will all become very messy, or do you think that there's some way for them to find a way to work together, even though they have some significant disagreements?
I think at least on the Israeli side, they will try to prevent it from becoming messy once again, like it did under the Obama administration. Who can forget, Joel? I think it was 2010 when Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't want to say lectured Obama in the Oval Office, but he basically ran down the true history, in my view, of the Middle East and how it works in the region as President Obama looked on, none too pleased, and things kind of really devolved in the years after that, of course. You make a great point. Joe Biden is seen as a more amiable kind of guy, more gregarious, where Obama was seen as maybe more cold and he approached the world in general. I hope that there would be warm relations. Things did not get off to a good start when Biden took about a month to even make a phone call to. On the Israeli side, certainly they don't want things to become such a public spat as they were under Obama, where in 2015, Prime Minister Netanyahu actually spoke before Congress he basically bypassing the Obama administration, saying, hey, we're getting nowhere with them. We'll take it to the American people and we will take it to the American Congress. And he spoke before a joint session of Congress. Will it get to that point again? If the Obama administration continues to push re-engagement with Iran and not only re-entering the deal, Joel, but re-entering an Iran nuclear deal, which is essentially the same as the 2015 deal, which means, number one, ballistic missiles are not even on the table, which means Iran's support for terror across the region and across the world are not mentioned in the deal. If it's a disastrous deal as it was in 2015, then you will certainly hear, I think, the administration in Israel speak out loudly about it. One more quick point here in regards to daylight, Joel. You make a great point there. I believe that Iran, the Iranian regime, and the enemies of Israel and the United States see daylight as more than daylight. They see it as a wedge between the two sides, and a wedge they can exploit. And they did exactly that during. Iran has been on the mark. Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq are essentially Iranian satellites right now. The daylight is harmful, a harmful message with Saudi Arabia.
We've been having some challenges throughout your interview, but they're getting worse. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to tie it off. I apologize because the points that you're making, the ones that I'm getting, have been very, very good. I think you're, if I heard it correctly, you've got several points. One, evangelicals are going to be very encouraged by and large if they see Netanyahu does in fact solidify this election. It's still too early, in my view, to know that. But if that were the case, your point is that evangelicals would look at that favorably. Number two, that the Biden administration will try to navigate and not have daylight be obvious, perhaps, with Netanyahu. But the Iran issue is so, Netanyahu and Biden have such fundamentally different views on how to approach it that may not be possible. And I think the last point you're making, any sense that there is daylight is going to be used as a wedge by Iranian forces and Iran's proxies and allies. And if I got all those correctly, I think that's an astute analysis.
Thank you, Joel. Yes,
Eric,
thank you.
If
you
so
can
much.
hear me,
I appreciate it.
Toda Rabbah. Thank you, guys. God bless. Sorry for the difficulties.
Great to be with you. Appreciate it very much.
Bye.
So that's really interesting.
Sego, go ahead.
No, I was saying that's really interesting. So what you're seeing is an increasingly polarizing situation. If the early indications are correct that the government is going to take a very rightward direction, then you've got a very right-wing, strong on defense, national security Israel. And then you've got Iran, which is taking advantage of what they perceive as American weakness. And then you've got America, which is, maybe going back toward the Obama days, maybe less so, but still not as friendly to Israel as the Trump era. So where, it looks like we're setting up a situation is where everybody's more in a corner or more polarized, and it could make for, some news in the next in the coming months, I guess.
Well, it will certainly be a target-rich environment for All Israel News and our sister site All Arab News, because it's just not. Well, I think it is clear that there's going to be some serious frictions between these two governments if it is Netanyahu, and if it isn't Netanyahu, then the whole deck of cards has been reshuffled. Now we're not there because I don't. It's not clear who would emerge as that person. Again, if Naftali Bennett or Gideon Sa'ar were in double digits, they'd have a much stronger case if Netanyahu cannot form a government, that maybe a right-wing government should be formed around them. But based on these numbers, they have a tough case to make. I mean, Gideon Sa'ar has essentially no case, but Naftali Bennett, I mean, he'll have to be praying every night for 3, 4, 5 seats to suddenly come his way in all the absentee ballots. I will note something, Nicole, that was interesting. We had several guests that were lined up tonight from sort of a range of different political parties, and all of them bailed. And it's interesting because they basically have gone into blackout mode because their parties, several of the ones that we talked to, simply underperformed so dramatically, or seem to have, that I think they're not sure what to say. And so at least 2 of them have contacted us to say, our entire party is going into blackout mode. We're not doing any interviews right now. They're trying to figure out what's really true. And are they out there saying, yeah, we blew it? Or are they waiting to say, let's find out what the real numbers are? Maybe we did better than we thought. It just looks difficult. Nicole, you've been here in Israel for how long?
Almost 20 years.
20 years. Okay. I've been here 7. And you've been a student of the country for a long time. There are times where these exit polls are just so wrong, and not because they're massively wrong, but they're just wrong enough that you go to bed thinking one thing,
yes, and
you wake up thinking something else. Are there some examples that come to mind for you?
There's at least 2 examples, but I remember in 2009 I was at Likud headquarters covering that and covering the election, and at the time Zippy Livni won the election for
she was the foreign minister running a party called
Was it
Kadima,
Kadima?
right? At
Kadima.
that time, it was
Right.
yeah, Kadima.
Progress or forward, forward.
Yeah.
I think the translation was forward. And so, I was at the Likud headquarters, and there was a sense of disappointment that I think, Netanyahu didn't win. So, wrote the story, went back home next day. Netanyahu, or maybe not the next day, but he is the one who eventually formed the government.
Right.
Livni failed to form a government. And then there was also, was it 96 with Shimon Peres?
Yeah. Oh gosh, that was very famous, right? Where in 1996, Yitzhak Rabin had been assassinated very tragically in 95. His ideological heir and his foreign minister was Shimon Peres, and everybody thought that all Rabin's beloved support would go to Peres. Benjamin Netanyahu was a novice. He had just emerged on the political scene as this sort of new challenger, right? And it was close. The exit polls were somewhat close, but everyone went to bed on that night thinking Shimon Peres was the declared winner. Okay, they all expected that, but when they woke up, Netanyahu's numbers had inched up, and he squeaked through, and he became the prime minister from 1996 to 1999. That was a dramatic night, and very few people saw that coming.
Right. So we don't know what can happen. Right now, I think a lot of what Ambassador Ayalon said is very valid and wise, and it looks like Netanyahu has the clearest path to victory. But, there's still an issue of the coalition building, and, that not everybody lines up according to right and left wing, and, people want the, cabinet positions, and they'll negotiate. And so we'll see how it's going to take a couple months it could take up to 3 months to play out. So, we'll see, of course, we'll keep everybody updated as we get the news, but we have some really good questions
Okay, good.
in the chat here. I'm going to start with we covered a little bit about New Hope and what to make of the low number of Gidon Saar's party. And I have to say, when he made his announcement, he had there was a lot of excitement, and it was, he was looked at as like the great alternative to a Netanyahu government, still right wing, still what people were looking for. And he took Yifat Shasha Biton, and, she was very respected for her, in the Knesset, in the Corona committee. So anyway, how do we explain how he went from, I think he was polling at 18 seats and now maybe 6? It looks like what are the exit polls saying? What do we have here on our screen?
Between
5 or 6. So
even if he picked up a couple in the absentee ballots, it's pretty bad. A couple thoughts, and it's an excellent question that this person is asking. Look, whenever you're challenging not just the leader of the country, but an iconic leader. I mean, let's face it, Bibi Netanyahu is an iconic leader. He's been around for a quarter of a century, not always as the prime minister, but he is the longest serving prime minister in the history of the country. And that tells you something. First, he has a deep reservoir of support. Number two, he has a deep reservoir of support in a party that's an institution in the country, meaning they have a great get out the vote campaign structure. Gidon Saar left Likud, but he started a party in December. It's very hard to get a party and all its apparatus and all its machinery up and running and tested in less than 3 months. Netanyahu also is a world leader. Right, for all his faults, and he has some very significant ones. And we try to, you and I have talked about this, and I want to say this to our readers and viewers. We believe that the way you should that we and reporters generally should cover politics and elections is like American football. Okay, now for those of you who are not in the United States, okay, but think of a sporting match where, but I'm going to use American football as the analogy because Nicole and I are originally from the United States. Like when you watch a Monday night football game or a Sunday afternoon football game, you're hearing the men and women in the booth call the play-by-plays and the color commentary. And if somebody does a really great sack, they are praised for it. If they do an interception, fabulous. That's an amazing catch. Let's look at that 12 different times, right? If the team is doing badly and they're blowing every play, they get dinged. But you don't have the sense in the booth that somebody, let's say, it's the Pittsburgh Steelers and the New England Patriots, that the people in the booth hate the Steelers, that they're doing everything they can to root against everything that the Steelers do right or well, and that the Patriots' flaws are never mentioned. But that's the way politics too often are covered. So I would say this, I think we have tried very hard, and I think we've done a good job as a new news organization to cover the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And I think that Guidon Sarr, as you say, we covered him as he coming out of the gate with a lot of excitement. But we've also described that his campaign wasn't doing well, that it was fading, that it wasn't being run well. And I would just say this: if you're taking on Benjamin Netanyahu, an iconic leader, you better announce and then explain what would you do differently. I don't think it's enough just to say we need to get rid of him. Okay, and you've got to give somebody to vote, something to vote for. Lay out your plans. And I think in this, and I mentioned this to Danny Ayalon, I think that Naftali Bennett did a better job with that on his tax plan, his Singapore plan. We covered that, and a couple of other things. But nevertheless, he seems to have had a hard night as well. So
I think,
we'll see. Look, Guidon Sarr is a fighter. I met him when he was in Likud, and Likud had been sort of blown up by Ariel Sharon, who left Likud and started this new Kadima party. And it was Bibi, Guidon, and 10 other people. They had been the largest party in the country, and then they were down to 12. I met Guidon then, and I've seen him fight over a long period of time. So we'll see whether he limps off the battlefield and doesn't want to play, or if he learns from this and does differently in the future.
Right. Well, and that leads us to another question, which I think is really important for overseas readers and especially evangelical Christians, because as Eric mentioned, evangelicals love Netanyahu.
Yes.
And, there's good reason for that. But so the question, I guess, for a lot of you, and by the way, I see you guys are from, a lot of you from the US, from New Zealand as well. What time is it there? And
that's very kind of you guys to be up that in the wee hours.
Yeah, or maybe it's tomorrow. I don't know, but thank you guys for joining us. This is
it's
great.
Tomorrow.
But I guess so. This is a really good question, and I think having lived in Israel for so long, I take it for granted. But why were all of these people lined up against Netanyahu? Why? Here's another thing. There were an estimated 50,000 protesters on Saturday night outside of Netanyahu's residence, and they've been protesting for months now, weekly. There's an they call themselves, the movement is called Crime Minister, not Prime Minister. And so it's important for us to explain to our readers why there's a sense in Israel that is anti-net, Israelis, many Israelis are anti-Netanyahu, and these opponents ran on that. It doesn't seem to have worked for them. So the question is why? What is he seen as corrupt, and why?
Yeah, so I think the main reason is not policy, right? You're talking about some 80, 85 votes or seats in the parliament, the Knesset, are going to be on the center right. 85 out of 120, that's a lot. So that puts into perspective, why can't Netanyahu get at least 61 of 85? And it's not policy. I mean, these guys disagree a little bit here and there. I would do that. It's Netanyahu. It's his style of leadership. Danny Ayalon and I, in our piece in Newsweek, we described that Netanyahu's style of management is so abrasive that he has embittered, angered, annoyed, frustrated, and alienated, and use all those words, so many of his own colleagues and sort of kindred spirits that they don't want to play ball with him anymore. So what you see as on television or in the newspapers in New Zealand or the United States or Canada or Europe, you see Netanyahu as a statesman. When you see him there, he is not playing inside baseball. He's not making sausages. He's not in a knife fight with his political partners. Mm-hmm. You're seeing him at his best, which is he is an incredible global statesman. But and this is not editorial on my part. We've tried to lay out on All Israel News so people wouldn't be shocked if Netanyahu does slip and can't yet again form a government, or if somebody else somehow does it. Our job is to report so you see how that could be possible. Mm-hmm. And what we're saying is, and we've reported it for months, there's a growing number of leaders who used to be the chief of staff for Netanyahu, the number 2 highest, most popular person in Netanyahu's political team, a former cabinet minister with him, a close political ally, a chief of staff of the army who worked side by side with Netanyahu. There's a growing number of these people who have said, I can't work with him ever again. I'm not going to do it. You could blame each one of those, and each one of them have their reasons. Sometimes they're petty and sometimes they are legitimate, but you have to look for a pattern. And I think the pattern at some point is Netanyahu is his own worst enemy. There's not somebody that has emerged as the opponent on his caliber, but he keeps alienating. Right. And this is a flaw, and has it caught up with him? Well, I think the fact that we've gone through 4 elections and we don't have a clear winner tonight, right, tells you that it's costing the nation. So
I also want to mention 2 more things. Netanyahu has been indicted on corruption charges. Right. He's not convicted. We don't know. He's still awaiting trial, and the trial has been delayed several times during the last year because of COVID shutdowns. They've shut down the courts, and so
there's been some preliminary hearings, but not a full-on trial yet.
Right. So that's one thing and that's why the movement was called Crime Minister. Right. The play on words there. So that's. But
on that, Nicole, I would say this. It's interesting. Let's just make this point. If you're a left-wing person or you already hate Netanyahu, then the indictments seem to justify and validate your view.
Right.
If you just are frustrated with Netanyahu, how he's handled the economy or how he handles his own management, or if you're a political leader who says, I can't stand you anymore, they're not using the indictments or the corruption as their main argument, which is interesting. It's not like Trump where they're saying, hey, you've been impeached and we're never going to, the center right is sort of ignoring that until the courts do their thing. They're using other arguments.
Right. That's true. And another point of contention with Netanyahu is that in order to maintain his base, he keeps the ultra-Orthodox parties in his coalition, which means a lot of compromising, like overlooking violations of COVID restrictions. There was a lot of that, like weddings of hundreds of people when, you weren't supposed to have more than 20 in a given location. And so that was happening, and it was considered, that they buried that. And also lately, we just had an article about another potential partner that he has brought in, which is a very, another religious party, very, very right-wing, some would say extreme. And many other leaders called out Netanyahu and said, you can't give them cabinet positions. Like you can, so it's the religious Zionism party. And also is that one. And then he also has Shas and United Torah Judaism. And together that's like over 20 seats. That's about 21 seats at least that he has. But in exchange for making partnerships with them, he will offer them very important positions like interior ministry and a
lot of money, a lot of budget money goes to these,
right,
to their
right.
projects and their communities.
So the Israeli left, and not just the left, but the secular, and of the secular Israelis, they're still very right wing, which is sometimes, contrary to American politics, because if you're a religious Christian, you're generally right wing. Whereas here in Israel, you can be secular and right wing. So anyway, so there's a lot that goes into why Israelis don't necessarily love Netanyahu, and yet here he is, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So going forward, if Netanyahu cannot form a government, now this is another question. Is there any likelihood that Likud would get another leader? Would Netanyahu get another leader to try to form a government?
At the moment, I don't see that the members of the actual Likud party as it exists at the moment would break with Netanyahu unless somebody forms an actual government and Likud is suddenly left in the opposition. Then I think Netanyahu would be humiliated. And then the question becomes, does he just to say, I'm going to come back and fight hard again? Or does he leave and go make millions and millions and millions of dollars, in private equity and, advising, sitting on boards and things. So, and the reason I say that I don't think the current Likud party has the stomach for it or even the desire for it is because those who did, they left.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They're already with
right.
Gideon Sa'ar or with Naftali Bennett or with Avigdor Lieberman, all of whom were the most loyal Likudniks on the planet. And now, but between them, they have about 20 seats or so. I'm not sure. We'll see. Maybe even a little bit more. But they're all ex-Likudniks. So
right.
I don't think the current party will ditch him.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's proven to be a formidable politician.
Oh my gosh. He is. And let's go to a few more questions and I'll try to give shorter answers, but these are really good questions.
Yeah.
And, but I will say this, somebody we haven't mentioned tonight and we need to is another surprise. And that's Benny Gantz. Right. Benny Gantz was the leader of a coalition of, 32, 33 seats. He became the defense minister and the alternate prime minister. But many people who voted for him felt betrayed that he would go into a government with Netanyahu. Now, the reason Gantz did it, he said, was because we were in a crisis and we had to deal with COVID and we needed a budget and we needed vaccines and we needed to work together and not just keep going to election after election. Right. So many people believe that Gantz did the right thing for the sake of the country, but many others said that he was, not only a traitor to the anti-Netanyahu team, but also that he was what they call in Israel a friar, and that's the worst thing to be called here in Israel, which is like a sucker. Like everybody knew that Netanyahu was going to welch on the deal that he made with you, Benny Gantz, but you didn't see it. You're such a sucker. Okay. So there was a moment a few weeks ago where you and I, Nicole, were reporting we were reporting the polls, and the polls were saying that Gantz was hanging on by his teeth and he might not even make it back into this round. But the polls tonight, the exit polls indicate he's got 7, 8 seats, could pick up another seat or two. We'll see. But Gantz seems to have been resurrected from the political dead, the walking dead here. And he's got this trump card in his pocket, which is if there's a stalemate, Benny Gantz is going to become the prime minister in November. Now, I think that's still quite unlikely. As Danny Ayalon said there's every incentive for Netanyahu to make sure that doesn't happen, but it's looming out there from the Netanyahu perspective.
I mean, it's really amazing. I mean, to me, blue and white was the surprise of the night, just because there were questions whether they were going to even make it into the Knesset.
Yeah.
Another surprise toward the end there is there's two parties, Labor and Meretz. Meretz was, their people were already writing the obituaries of Meretz. Meretz is a very left wing party.
As far left as you can go.
Exactly. And people were writing their obituary. The party was done. It was on all the political, the Saturday Night Live of Israel, basically, ended the party, said it's over. And here they're polling at 6 or 7, which is amazing. And then there was Labor, which is the only party led by a female in this lineup right here.
Right.
And actually, people didn't think that they were going to get 4 or 5 seats. And Mirav Michaeli, she got about 7, according to these polls. So now these two left-wing parties, they have a combined 13 to 14 seats, which is actually, compared to what we were thinking that they were going to get, maybe 5, a combined 5, if you can imagine. And now they're in the double digits. And if they work with Benny Gantz, who's center, and possibly Yesh Atid, they have a formidable opposition. I can't say, of course, we can't predict now if any of them could, build a government, but there is a large block of left wing, despite the very right wing nature of this polling.
Well, just to clarify, I think we can definitely say that the left bloc cannot form a government.
Okay, yes.
However, I think that what they can do is, the question is whether the left and the center right, all of whom don't want Netanyahu, can they pick someone and form enough seats and sort of overcome all of their ideological differences? It seems unlikely, but I'll tell you, an X factor that we should mention here is the joint list. Now, the joint list is about 8 or 9 seats at the moment, which is a significant drop. The Arab turnout was, maybe 2/3 of what it had been last time. Arab voters are, by and large, I talked to actually an Arab political analyst tonight before we came on this, and he said, there's just so much discouragement in the Israeli Arab community because they just keep electing leaders who just don't do anything. They never join a government. They never, therefore, have any leverage to bring money and support and political help to the Arab communities who are struggling economically and with crime and so forth. So here's a question, and I don't think we can answer it. I'm just going to leave it out there. I mean, I'm just asking it as a question, but is there a scenario in which joint list supports an anti-Netanyahu government but doesn't join it? But there's, in Israeli politics, you can actually support a prime minister. It's called a minority government. So somebody like Lapid or even like, somebody else, but let's say Lapid for the moment, could form a government, and joint list could say, we are not going to join it because it violates our principles. But we want Netanyahu out so badly that we'll vote on the day of the, making a decision in the Knesset, who's going to be the next prime minister. We'll vote for Lapid or for Gideon Sa'ar or theoretically for Bennett. I don't see that. The question is, does the joint list feel that they have been punished by their voters? Mm-hmm. And if they feel that, do they feel that the answer is to get engaged politically in a way that they haven't? I don't know. It's not a world I understand. We've been trying to do more coverage with All Israel News on the Arab community because it's so important. And these voters feel very left out, and they are, but not because they don't have the right to vote or form a party or become a Knesset member, but because their Knesset members don't do anything. They vote, the Arab Knesset members, every single one of them voted against the Arab-Israeli peace accords, the Abraham Accords, a few months ago. You think, if Arab Israelis don't want peace, what is it that they want? So, all right, let's do a few lightning round, and then I think we should wrap for tonight.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
These are good questions.
Yeah, they are. Which side do you think benefits more from the multitude of parties? So there's a lot of, as we saw, there's so many parties, and so many of them there at the end just have about, between 5 to 9 votes.
Yeah, Netanyahu is the number one beneficiary of all the splintered smaller votes, because when we say that the center right parties have 80 to 85 seats, that's true. But if you flip it and you say, who are all the seats that are against Netanyahu, that's somewhere up in the 65 to 70 seat range, right? So, or at least potentially maybe mid 60s, but they can't coalesce. And Netanyahu benefits from a splintered opposition. Okay.
Yeah, that's true. We've seen this play out. And are there any members of Likud currently who could possibly be a successor to Netanyahu? I mean, I know we talked about the fact that right now, probably not, but what about in the future? I mean, there's Nir Barkat. He's the former mayor of Jerusalem.
Right.
Avi Dichter. I don't know. Do you see anybody rising?
There are some wonderful people in the Likud party who have a lot of experience. I think your point about Nir Barkat, who was almost invisible in this race. I got to tell you, it's like anybody in Likud didn't exist. It was Netanyahu, and that was it. Zeu, we would say in Hebrew, right? That's it. Like you almost hardly heard anybody else talk except about Netanyahu or by Netanyahu. But one of Netanyahu's weaknesses is that he doesn't like to make disciples. Okay, if somebody is growing and maturing and advancing, he seems to get nervous, and that's why they leave. Mm-hmm. That's why Lieberman left. That's why Bennett left. That's why Gidon Sar left. That's why Boogie Ya'alon left. That's why there's others. There's actually a long list. But so Bibi doesn't like to have people around him that are really emerging, and you think, oh, that's the next guy. But there are some. Gilad Arden, I think, is one. But Netanyahu very shrewdly sent him to the United States to make him both the ambassador to the United States, but also to the UN.
Right.
Now, for a few years, that makes Gilad Arden not a problem for Netanyahu because he's doing a job and he's not political. He's part of the government. But he's also creating a future leader who's going to be seen in the United States and seen worldwide as an emerging leader. If he does a good job, Gilad Arden is not a name that most people know, but he could become, at least for the Americans, the Nikki Haley or the Mike Pompeo of Israel, which is a formidable future contender.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, and
I will say there's one of there are several other, but Nir Barkat, because he was mayor of Jerusalem, he's actually managed the city. Let's note that Jerusalem is the second largest city, or I'm sorry, it's the largest city. Sorry, it's the largest city in Israel. It's incredibly complex. It's incredibly varied demographically, ethnically, Arabs, Jews, Christians. And Nir Barkat was a very successful mayor, very well respected. Mm-hmm. And I think I think he's lying low right now because you can't get in the glare of Bibi Netanyahu. It's politically risky and it doesn't help you.
Right.
But over time, where else can you learn how to actually govern in Israel? There's no governors, right? We're like one American state or one British province or New Zealand province or something. You can't run something else except a cabinet office, except Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. And so keep your eye on Nir Barkat. I think we should profile him, interview him, get to know him better in the year and two ahead, because I think he's somebody, he and Gilad Arden are people I would watch. And then the other person I would just say is Ron Dermer, who spent 7 years as the Israeli ambassador to the United States, is a very, very close, the closest political advisor and foreign policy advisor to Netanyahu. just came back to Israel after serving in the United States, didn't join this race, but is the type of person who could emerge if he decides. He probably wants to make a little money for his family. He's been in government for a while, and he's got young kids. I've known Ambassador Dermer for a number of years, 20 years. So he's somebody I would keep an eye on as well.
Okay. Another question was about, you know, how a Biden administration would react with Bennett. Now, with Naftali Bennett from Yamina in the coalition. I'd like to add, though, that not just Naftali Bennett, but you have even more right-wing than Naftali Bennett. You have the Religious Zionism Party, which is with Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are very controversial right-wing figures who will not give up an inch of land, and they don't want a two-state solution. So this is, this is. Are we on a collision course with the Biden administration?
I think we probably are on a collision course, and I think this is probably a good way to wrap. We'll be at the 90-minute point in a moment. There's so many other good questions. We'll just have to look at those and start writing articles to answer your questions. Thank you, everyone who are writing. But I will say this: you bring up, I think, one of the most painful elements of this race, and a party that overperformed what people thought, and that is the Religious Zionism Party, which is an alliance of two parties that have been denounced across the board in Israel as extremists and even as racists. Nicole, you did an excellent article, which is still on the All Israel News homepage right now, looking at why is Netanyahu working with a party that so widely denounced as extremists and even possibly racist. I mean, and I say that because we're, at All Israel News, we're not taking editorial position on it. We're reporting what has been said, and you did a really impressive job digging out quotes I wasn't aware that they'd said, these two leaders of this party, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but also what has been said about them, and that one of them was the lawyer defending a religious Jewish terrorist, Israeli terrorist, who murdered a Palestinian family, including their children, in their beds. Mm-hmm. It's an article worth reading because while that's not something that most people who pay attention to Israel are going to notice, the Biden administration is going to notice. And it's going to bother them as it bothers many Israelis. It really seems out of character. I should say this also. I haven't mentioned it all, and I didn't mean to avoid it. I forgot to say it. In full disclosure, I did work for Netanyahu on his political campaign 21 years ago, in the fall of 2000, on his comeback campaign. Now, he didn't come back for 9 more years, so that was my last client in the political sphere. I haven't actually even had a meeting with Netanyahu in 10 years, so I'm not personally close to him. I know a number of his advisors, and we've been reporting on them and talking to them very frequently, and we try to cover Netanyahu very fairly. But in full disclosure, I did work for him 21 years ago. So that has given me an ability to see his strengths and also his weaknesses. And I have to tell you, Nicole, that I think it's an act of political desperation that Netanyahu almost single-handedly helped this group of people who really had no chance of running, much less winning, much less entering the Knesset. Netanyahu breathed life into them. And why did he do it? He did it because he thought, I'm going to need those 5, 6, or 7, or 8 seats. Now, politics is strange bedfellows, but that's not the Netanyahu that I know or I remember. And again, these are the types of things. This is one of the reasons Gideon Sa'ar says, I can't ever work with Netanyahu. It's because of this party. Bennett is saying, I won't work with them if those guys are going to be in the cabinet. Mm-hmm. But he's sort of not gone further than that. And others have just denounced Netanyahu. Look, do the ends justify the means? we're not here tonight to give a political assessment, but I will say that this is a problem, and it's one that's been easily overlooked because there's so many other things to talk about. We haven't really talked about it until pretty much the end of the program. Mm-hmm. But the Biden team is going to see it. They're looking at it. It's going to bother them, and they're going to talk about it at some point. And Netanyahu's going to have a hard time telling a group of people that have 6 or 7 seats that they can't have cabinet positions if he needs Naftali Bennett with 7 or 8 or whatever seats it is. And he's going to get, Naftali Bennett is probably going to get, if he decides to go with Bibi, he's going to get defense ministry. He might get foreign ministry. He could get the justice ministry. He could get some of the top positions, but he has the same number of seats at the moment as this party, religious Zionism, that's been denounced as extremist and racist, and for good reason. There's a real case that these guys are beyond. They're definitely not in the mainstream, but they're beyond the pale in many. Right. So that's something to keep an eye on. But look, as we wrap up, let's wrap up with the line that Danny Ayalon put in, and I put in this Newsweek piece, which is Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu is a shrewd political cat. He has been fighting on the political battlefield in Israel for a quarter of a century. And anybody that tries to run against him looks like a novice, right? So Netanyahu has some significant flaws, right? But he has very impressive strengths. Remember, he's the guy that's kept Iran from getting the bomb. He's the guy that built 4 Arab-Israeli peace deals in the last several months. Netanyahu is the one that persuaded Trump to move the U.S. embassy to Israel, to Jerusalem, and to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel. It was Netanyahu that persuaded Trump to recognize the sovereignty of Israel over the Golan Heights and many other issues. Netanyahu's strengths are incredibly impressive. He's a very complicated figure, which I should write a novel about, but I haven't quite figured out how. And he's got good and bad mixed in him. But what he has most of all in the current environment is he has 25 years of political experience. And most of these guys who want to run against him, they just don't. And even we've been talking about it, and I'll close on this thought. I'll let you have the last word, Nicole, but I would just say this. I was sitting with a former chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces just a few months ago. It's not a name that most people would know, so I won't use it right now, but he was considering starting his own party or joining another party. And I sat with him. I was interviewing him. He was not ready to go on the record, but he wanted to get to know me. I wanted to get to know him, and we had a very interesting conversation. But I'll just say, I said to him, if you run, and I'm not taking a position, we're a nonpartisan, website, but if you run, you better have a clear agenda that you intend to advance, right? You can't just be against Netanyahu. You have to be for something, right? But what's more, remember, you and Benny Gantz, who was an IDF chief of staff, and Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, who was a IDF chief of staff and now is out of politics. Gabi Ashkenazi, our current foreign minister, was a former IDF chief of staff. He's leaving. He's retiring from politics. All these and several others, they are the best generals that Israel has produced in a generation. On the military battlefield, they are second to none. But on the political battlefield, they keep going down one after another to Benjamin Netanyahu. Why? Because the skill sets that you develop on the military battlefield are not transferable. The respect is, the sense of accomplishment is, but almost nothing else about the military battlefield is the same as the political battlefield. So I said to this very highly respected and decorated chief of staff, I said, just be aware that Netanyahu is a combatant that you would be taking on who has 25 to 30 years of combat experience that you don't have. and he decided not to run. I'm not saying it's because of me, but I'm just saying this is what people need to know, that this Netanyahu is impressive, and almost everybody else looks like a beginner when they're up against him. All right, Nicole, you get the last word on this very interesting evening.
I think that's a great way to sum it up. I think that's how it's looking. Of course, what we can, I guess the only thing that's clear though is that it's not fully clear. We've got weeks of reporting ahead of us, so stay tuned with us. We will be for sure tracking all of the developments, who is jockeying for what position, and where the compromises come in and where people stand their ground on other things. So I mean, it's a very complicated system here, but we're going to try to break it down for you. And I think Israel is in God's hands, and I think we need to remember that. Of course, it looks like it's maybe going to be in Netanyahu's hands, but none of us know that, and none of us know what the opposition is going to do or what's going to come up. But we do know that the God of Israel never sleeps or slumbers. So I think we should, leave it on that positive note, that no matter what happens politically, that spiritually Israel's in good hands, and we will be tracking all that's happening here. And Joel, there is one more question. They want to know when you're running for office.
Oh, I'm definitely not. I am a failed political consultant. Everyone I ever worked for lost or was thwarted in their political ambitions, at least when I was around, including the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. So that is not that's not my gig, but I love doing this with you, Nicole, and the rest of our Israeli, Palestinian, Lebanese, and American team running all Israel news and all Arab news. There's so many interesting things going on here, and it's so frustrating to watch so much of the rest of the media, especially the Western media, that just doesn't understand what's happening here. But you and I don't want to get mad. We want to just do a good job and help people, help inform people. And so I appreciate you being on this team.
Well, I want to say also that I love being on this team. This is a lot of fun. I want to thank all of the staff that's working behind the scenes to make this happen, with the great charts and filtering between the cameras and sending me questions. I really appreciate it. And this is a lot of fun. This is a big
I should tell people in the United States that I will be on Fox News to do election analysis. It'll be at about 11:30 Eastern time tonight. For me, that's 5:30 in the morning. But you don't have to feel badly for me. This is what I do. But I do want to let people know I'll be on Fox News live from Jerusalem here at 11:30 or so Eastern time.
Well, that's awesome. Well, it's been fun discussing this with you guys and just being able to take the time and to break things down. There's so many aspects that go into the Israeli government and building the coalition. So this was great. Thank you for your patience and just letting us hash it out. And check out Joel on Fox later, and sign up for our newsletter so you can see what we're doing, we'll keep you posted on all this. But I just want to thank you all. I want to say shalom from Jerusalem, and have a great rest of your evening or your day, wherever you may be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.